So this part is known as invisible chain and sweet knife. So these are the two ways in which oxymoron can be discussed. All right. Then this is point number 3. Next, we are moving on towards these. What are we doing right now? We call this literary devices. Oxymoron is a contradiction, and with the poet or the dramatist or any writer uses to tell us about the two opposite ideas. So we have invisible chain as one example. The other one is sweet knife. We are doing literary devices. So we have number 4, which is called a paradox. Okay, a paradox. Now, this contradiction exists in one expression. A paradox is basically a contradiction that is developed, contradiction which develops or completes in a full way at the end of the text. At the end of the text. So, for example, at the beginning of the text, he said something else that, when you completely emphasize upon an idea, there is a poem which is called The Pride of Lions, and you will be doing it also gradually. There is a poem, Pride of Lions. So in this poem, there is a paradox that initially the wife complains and she says that I'm unhappy in my life, and how come I can make my husband really satisfied when it comes to home chores, and she's complaining and she's in pain and misery. But towards the end, she exactly says the opposite, and she says, but towards the end, she says that I cannot live without him. So it's almost like that her role has been completed by the presence of her husband. Getting the point? A paradox is a contradiction, but it takes its full shape by the end of the text. It is a contradiction, but you won't say. And the condition to understand paradox is, let me give you another example. The priest in the church. Okay, let's say the concept of a father in a church. So you must have noticed that they wear collar. Have you seen, like in Anglican churches, the father, the priest we are talking about, father in a church, they wear a collar which is white colored from the bottom and it's black from the outside, I mean the outline. So it is a symbol that they have to be refrained from the materialistic worlds. I mean, materialistic pleasure. They cannot be just like any ordinary man. They are special. They have the holy responsibility. But what if the person himself says that it's a chain around my neck and it strangles me? This is contradiction. You don't agree with what you have said in the beginning. Mahanur, did you understand the concept, Vida? Caller.
Yes, miss.
So it's a matter of a holy responsibility, but at the same time, it is to be taken as 1 minute. Holy responsibility in one, and but the later part it says that it's strangling me. This is the contradiction. You said something else in the beginning, but the character will have to imply the same. So this is called a paradox. Safat, is this clear?
Yes.
Safat, is this clear? This class is very, very important because it's the foundation for your understanding of the types of text. All right. So we need to be very, very clear about it. Next, we are moving on.
Miss,
Yes, Beta.
Is it necessary that the difference, for example, you told us that it is a holy responsibility for them. So we
Hmm.
went under lines. We had to understand that he is a church, so that's why, like he's a priest, so that's why
Hmm.
he has this holy responsibility,
Yes, yes, yes. It will be mentioned. It will
and
be
that's why
given.
we compared it to the strangling part.
Yes. Let me give you one more
Okay,
example,
okay.
beta. Let me give you one more example. So there is a novel which is called Rebecca. Okay. Rebecca has left her house. They have moved to a different place. So basically, she used to live in a house and she was really sad, but she moved to a different house. Moved to a different house. And she cannot help but thinking about the same house. So while she was asleep that night, she visited the same house in her dream. In her dream. So she realized that her house, while entering the house in a dream, she realized that it must be surrounded by the overgrown plants, and there will be no path to be seen. The cobwebs will be there, and I will not be able to enter the house even, because nobody would be able to take care of it. But when she struggles, so she had a perception that it will be, abandoned place. It was an abandoned place when she initially starts, in her dream, like like a soul. She is um, passing through the metallic bars of the gate as well. So she's passing through, but the moment she steps right over here, she realizes that her house has been preserved by nature. It's exactly in the same way, kept as it is. And this was to her shock. And this was a paradox, basically, what she actually thought and what turned out to be. So it was ironic at the same time, but when you read between the lines, you will realize that it was quite a paradoxical term. So, but you have understood from this concept even that in a paradox there will be a holy responsibility. One thing that he says, that I have been chosen by God to guide the mankind. I am the father and I will be taking my religious responsibilities. And then, but towards the end, somewhere he is complaining that it doesn't allow me to exercise my human needs. As such, I need to curb, I need to prevent myself from all the worldly pleasures. So it's a contradiction that has been developed, and this is called paradox. Let's proceed to another technique, and which is called juxtaposition. I will show you the difference between the term. This is a concept clearing ideas. So we have juxtaposition and versus the contrast. Okay, the contrast is the two opposite ideas. What are these contrasts? Two, there's a discrepancy, there is a difference. Two different, two different ideas given in a poem or a text, any sort of text. So it's like contrast means that perhaps I am hopeless at the beginning, but later in the text I will be hopeful, right? So contrast can be taken as opposite ideas. They're opposites to each other, right? So because they're two different ideas. So but then this feeling, like being hopeless and hopeful, will be communicated by the entire text. This will be given beta, in the entire text. Now, what is juxtaposition? Juxtaposition is also a contrast, but in the nearest proximity. But in the nearest, but in the nearest proximity. Now, what do we mean by that? This means that juxtaposition is usually found within the same para, like one para. You will find juxtaposition in one paragraph, contrast, but in the nearest proximity. They will be very close to each other. So, for example, let's say in a poem it says sleep, and it can be within the same line also: sleep, awake. Or it could be morning and night. All of these expressions, if you find within the same paragraph or within the same line. Is this clear? This
Yes,
will be
miss.
taking an account of an overall text. Is this clear? Juxtaposition, the difference, the different two ideas together, but in the nearest proximity. Contrast, two different ideas given in a poem or a text, but they will be given at the start and towards the end of the text. Text means a passage, a little extract that will be given in the exam paper or your practice worksheets. Over here, there is any confusion, please do let me know.
No, miss.
No,
Okay,
miss.
Safat has responded. What about Mahnur?
No, miss.
All right. So we are moving on towards the another part, which is called allusion. Allusion is another literary device. Allusion. I hope you are listing down. Are we writing better? Can we be loud and clear?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, miss.
Allusion is basically a reference. So it's basically a reference to any idea. Let me just be more specific. Allusions are used like biblical references, biblical allusions from Bible, because we are doing English literature. So you will come across from the Bible allusions. There will be religious references which will be given, religious references used in the poem to convey a strong sense of conviction. Like when people quote, for example, let me tell you, for example, our Prime Minister Imran Khan, he uses a lot of allusions. A lot of times he says Hazrat Umar Ali Razi Allah Ta'ala Anha. His quotation is, he quotes it within his speeches. So what is he doing? He's giving a lot of um, references from the our holy book. And why? Because it gives more authenticity. It gives more authenticity to the character, that nobody could doubt his character, nobody would be able to doubt him. So biblical allusions, like biblical references. So we have a poem in which we have some religious influences from taken few expressions, that it's basically a poem that deals with death, and he believes in the power of life after death. So he is quoting from the Old Testament, a line, Old Testament, and Whenever anything is quoted from the Bible, that is to be taken as allusion. Allusion, all right? So is this clear now? Let's move on to the next idea. Shall we move? Caesura, you already know, but I'm going to make it even more clear. So we have a caesura. Caesura are of two types, is strong and weak. So these are basically identified with the help of punctuation. Punctuation as in like we have semicolon, we have comma. These are the two ways by which you can identify a caesura. What is a caesura? Caesura is basically a pause. So, but it is usually identified by these two. If you come across a caesura by the caesura by the end of a sentence, by the end of a sentence, this is going to be usually mostly identified with a semicolon, turns out to be a strong caesura. And then the examiner wants us to comment on it. Why? Why it's a strong caesura? Because it serves the purpose of dramatic pause. All right, or it creates an element of shock, or you have to connect this idea with the overall text. Element of shock, or it could be that perhaps reflecting or pondering upon a certain issue, upon a certain issue. So you have caesura, a strong one, but let's have a quick look at this side, and we have here a weak pause, a weak caesura. This will only be used to build up more tension. It basically elevates an element of anticipation. So when you know these terminologies, you're able to look at the text at a different level. You're able to identify some of the ways in which the poet is trying to create an overall impression about the text. So we've got elevates an element of anticipation, plus it could be a slight as if you have to say slight dullness in the tone, of the poet. So it can communicate various aspects, but again, these pauses are to be recognized when it comes to the context of the text. All right. So there is an irony. What do we mean by irony? Irony means the reversal of your expectations. Reversal of your expectations. Look at the way in A Wife in London, how it's quite ironic that now that her husband is, has reached to another imaginary world, I mean, to the spiritual world, he's no more. And then she can't help but thinking that reading the letter that he must have been here with me. She never expected to receive a news of his death, and she was waiting for the moment that they are going to be together. So it came as a shock. It came as the reversal of her expectation. So that was an ironic part. It's ironic. Um, there can be another example for it. Um, Mahnur, are you there with me?
Yes, miss, I'm here.
You're here. So you need to understand one more thing, beta, that with irony, you need to understand two most important elements. Number one, there has to be something shocking or opposite that must have had happened. You have to see what unexpected thing took place. What unexpected thing took place? And this part is hard to catch, but usually not every poem has this. Please remember that all these literary devices that I'm teaching you, they all will not be present in one poem or in one text. There may be some of them, there may be all of them, but not every time. You have to be very selective, and you're going to do this under the supervision of the teacher so that you have an idea how to identify them. Is there any question over here? Because I need to go on with parallel. What do we mean by parallel? How do you actually have an okay? So what do we mean parallel? Parallel is usually means the balance. The balance. If there is a dark, let's say dark imagery at the start of the poem, at the start of the poem, and it parallel means like equal in one or the other way, and it remains the same towards the later part of the poem also, then it will turn out to be at the start and even the later. So that means it's a sort of a parallel. The parallel has been drawn between two same things, dark imagery, and there is we have in other ways grotesque imagery, something which is evil looking or grotesque. So it's a parallel, like two things in the same manner are used, so we say that it's a parallel, it's been treated equally, they stand to each other,
Yes.
you know next to each other. These are the two things, so we call this parallel. What do
Yes.
we mean by this term, which is called alliteration? What is an alliteration? Okay, in one line or a sentence, in one line or a sentence, two or more words, two or more words start with the same sound, start with the same sound. This will be known as alliteration. So, can you tell me which is an alliteration over here? All right, so scorching sun, wicked witch, and then we have which one is two or more words that start with the same sound. So which one is an alliteration and which one is not? Are all of these are alliteration?
No.
No or yes? No, we're not going to work out with that. You have to explain, beta. You have to tell me which one. You have to say the name, I mean the example basically.
Miss, number 2 alliteration है.
Okay, so you're saying that number 2 is alliteration. Mahnur, what do you have, Peter? This is an alliteration. What about this?
Because they're all same alliterations to me.
They all are same equally. Safar, do you agree with Mahnur, Beta? Is this an alliteration? Please pay
Yes.
attention. No, this is not an
हाँ
alliteration.
जी मैं इसमें स्कॉचिंग सन क्या बोल रहा था?
Acha. This is an alliteration because over here W is silent. It will be pronounced as wretched witch. You see, W is silent. The statement says 2 or more words start with the same sound. It says the sound. It doesn't say the alphabet. It doesn't say the alphabet. It talks about the sound. Wretched witch. It doesn't say wretched witch. Wicked witch. Alliterations. These two S sound. Alliteration. Okay, Manur beta.
Okay,
You
miss.
have to understand the sound, not look at the letter and be dodged by it. So this is not an alliteration. Is there any confusion? Please do let me know right now. Is there any confusion?
No.
Okay, there is no
No,
confusion.
miss.
Okay, chalo, that's good. You have copied it down. Now let me, because I know it's almost going to be 8:44, but I need to share with you something important, and which is called, I'm going to give you, no, not this one. Hold on, let me just share this slide. Yeah, okay, now we are here. You can look at the screen, right? So what do you see in the picture? What do you see in the picture? What kind of an
Miss,
expression has been communicated?
a very uncomfortable man.
A very uncomfortable person. Do you actually think he's sleeping?
Yes.
No, miss. He's
No,
clenching the
Manu. Yeah, out loud, beta. I think your voice I can't hear. Or
Miss, now can you hear me?
yes, now I can hear you finally. Thank
Okay.
you.
Miss, I'm saying because he's clenching the blanket and his facial expressions look like he's not sleeping at all.
Very good. Quite an observant. This is the eye we need for literature lovers. You know, you have to make up a point. So he's clenching onto the, to the blanket. And if you notice right here, I hope I can show it to you. This part, he's frowning as if he really wants to sleep, but he cannot. And it's a very awkward angle. His neck has been craning at the same time. And the title resonates the same thing, The Pains of Sleep by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. This poem is written in the 17th century. And there was a point where he was at the very pit of his career. Like he was the one who started the Romantics era. He was so popularly known amongst his all contemporaries, the other poets as well, that he inspired others to become a poet. But what just happened with him? Anxiety struck him. There was a great level of depression. Why? Because back in that time, Coleridge himself, we are talking about Samuel Taylor Coleridge. This is his personal poem, a very private, uh, a kind of insight that we have been given into his real life. So, what actually happened? What is he talking about? He's talking about the 3 nights consecutively where he had failed to go to sleep. So he is now returning to God, and he's praying for the satisfaction of his soul. So you need to realize one thing: in literature, you will try to explore some of the psychological aspects of a character, how one thinks, and how they're unable to tackle with one of the situations. He couldn't compose his poems without uh, taking some sort of drugs. And that was a shame for his career because public started criticizing quite often. And we are going to look at the next part of the slide so you have an idea what exactly are we talking about. So it's this: Samuel Taylor Coleridge is one of the most widely praised of the romantic poets. Why are we calling romantic? Was he in love with a lady? Well, maybe. And there are some evidences in the text also. But by romantic poet, we don't mean a romantic relationship. Indeed, it means the poets who were taking inspiration to write about nature, taking inspiration from nature. They could fall in love with the changes in the season, the elements of nature like water, fire, earth, air. They were the ones who can't help but talk about certain things. This is important to understand because his writings have a depth of feeling and imagery as in visual imagery, that is profoundly unique. His troubled life and mental complexes influenced his writing. Nightmares plagued him on a consistent basis, and his upbringing left him with a complicated array of neuroses. Neuroses characterized by narcissistic tendencies. You need to understand over here two important ideas. One, that he had a troubled career. Nobody was happy with him. The way he was indulged into some inapt activities, for example, consuming of drugs and mental complexes, because then people, critics, public was not accepting him as a poet who can create a greater influence because of his immoral behavior immoral behavior, and his upbringing. In light of these complicated mental processes, Coleridge would have undoubtedly been fascinated by the mind. I tell you honestly, Shakespeare was also very much fascinated by the working of the mind because it was only in the 1500s where the first asylum was, established, and people started realizing that mental well-being is also important. But again, it was not so popular back in the Shakespearean times, which is 16th century. Shakespeare belongs to the 16th century. Coleridge as a poet belongs to the 17th century. So the fascination is particularly well evidenced in The Pains of Sleep. I want your impression about Samuel Taylor Coleridge. What do you think about him? What do you think that what kind of a poet is he? What impression after that I've given you introduction? Are you thinking to yourself and you're asking a question, why? Why would such a thing be happening to him? What is your impression? Do you actually think um yes, Manu, do you actually think that it's going to be of a problem? What do we call that? A person who cannot sleep the whole night. There is a disease name. What do we call that? A disorder, not a disease as such. A disorder. What do we call that?
Amnesia.
Okay, amnesia, yes, and safat. Hmm. I want you to find out. We call this insomnia. What do we call this?
Yes, miss, I
Insomnia.
forgot the
Insomnia.
term.
It's okay. It's okay. It's fine. You're learning. Mistakes are possible, but you're not going to make a mistake. How come you're going to learn then? We need to be very positive about this. All right. So, insomnia, please write it down. There is insomnia versus hyperinsomnia, where there are consecutive 3 to 5 nights when the person tries to sleep but cannot. And these are the running and recurring themes in literature, specifically Henry IV, Part 2, written by William Shakespeare. Coleridge used his poetry to explore conflicting issues in philosophy and religious piety. Philosophy about life, religious attitude. A lot of people at that time were quite, he doesn't wanted to be, he never wanted to be labeled as a hypocrite, doing something in hiding and then exposing some other attribute of his character to others. What he was, he was. He was transparent in front of the public, but they were never ready to accept him as a great influencer, as a writer. So, Mahnur, could you please read this slide?
Sure, miss. Coleridge used his poetry to explore conflicting issues in philosophy and religious piety. Some critics argue that Coleridge's interest in philosophy was simply his attempt to understand the imaginative and intellectual impulses that fueled his poetry. To support the claim that his imaginative and intellectual forces were, in fact, organic and derived from the natural world, Coleridge linked them to God spiritually and worship, opportunity to develop a relationship with God and with nature.
So he's using this poem beta as an opportunity to develop a relationship with God and nature. All right. When nature comes, nature is an ultimate source of power, and it is God. We're talking about destiny. One more thing that I want you to mention over to see, intellectual forces were like he was imaginative. He's supporting the claim that his imaginative and intellectual forces were in fact organic and derived from the natural world. And Coleridge is trying to link himself to God and return to the spirituality and start worshiping God. So you also realize when you are at the toughest of your, the challenges or the situation, only then you realize your true strength. And perhaps he's alone. He's been considered as an outcast from the society, so people are definitely looking at him um, with a scornful in a scornful manner, and he's returning to God. Perhaps this power is going to give him some ways. Interesting factor, when he writes a poem, he uses a conversational pattern as if he's talking to God. Now, this resonates with our religion as well. How much do you agree with this part? The conversational method, the pattern that he uses in his poem. And this shows that his um, his close bonding with God. All right. So Coleridge wanted to mimic. Manur, over to you again, Beta.
Okay, miss. Coleridge wanted to mimic the patterns and cadences of everyday speech in his poetry. Many of his poems openly addresses a single figure, the speaker's wife, son, friend, and so on, who listens silently to the simple, straightforward language of the speaker. Unlike the descriptive, long, digressive poems of Coleridge's classicist predecessors, Coleridge's so-called conversational poems are brief, self-contained, and often without a discernible poetic form.
Okay, now
Colloquial.
now we're gonna wait over here. Now try to understand. The first part is Coleridge wanted to mimic, copy the patterns and cadences, means the way people speak with highs and lows in the rhythm of their speech. When you talk Mahnur, Safar talks, you have a certain cadence to it. You will take the higher note and sometimes the lower. It depends upon the kind of conversation that you're taking place. that you're doing. Everyday speech in his poetry. Many of his poems openly addresses a single figure, the speaker's wife, son, friend, and so on. So he would be talking about one person at one time who listens silently to the simple, straightforward language of the speaker. Unlike his writing was very much different than the descriptive, long, digressive poems of Coleridge's classicist predecessors. That means prior to him, all those other poets, they were writing in a different manner. They were more elaborate and descriptive, but he isn't. Coleridge's so called conversation poems, and this, The Pains of Sleep, is definitely a conversational poem. It turns out to be a bit brief, self contained, and often without a discernible poetic form. You will not find the rhythm as such. You will have here and there, but not exactly much of a rhythm. So I will stop right over here. We're going to continue in our next class, and let's look forward. I want you to just do your a bit of research work. Your homework is, please note down your homework. The previous poem, A Wife in
Yes, ma'am.
London, I want you to write down an overview, a comprehensive, a brief overview of the poem A Wife in London, and read thoroughly this poem, which is The Pains of Sleep. And I'm sharing both of the poems in um, our WhatsApp group that we have. Okay, so
Yes,
that's
ma'am.
it for today. I need to go for my next class. Thank you so much. Take good care.
Allah Hafiz.